I'm Jonathan Larsen, and I want to start off today's edition of TYTI Daily by saying what pretty much everyone talking on video or cable news or broadcast news should be saying today when they discuss what has happened in Iran, which is to say, I'm not an expert on Iran. So I don't have any special deep information. What I do have is I read an article, and I want to talk about some specific pieces of that article, and I want to make some points about how we think about these things and how we process them on a media level and on a national level along the way. And if you want to know my bona fides on this stuff, when I was working in TV back in 2003, before the invasion of Iraq, we got a briefing from a CIA guy. And it was clear to me that it was BS. It was clear to me that whatever the intel said, whatever the intel was, legitimately or otherwise, about the weapons that Iraq had, the threat that it posed, what it lacked, what this threat assessment, what this PR propaganda campaign lacked, was an actual credible grown-up sense of how adults work. Just psychologically, it made no sense. Even if you bought that Saddam Hussein had all these weapons, the idea that he was then going to pick a fight with the US was credible only if you accepted the premise that he was insane. And so I want to get to the discussion today about Qasem Soleimani, if I'm saying his name right, the head of the Quds Force in Iran. This is the branch of the Revolutionary Guard that sort of was created, my understanding is, essentially to make sure that the military did not revolt against the then new Islamic Revolution. And the article, singular, because I didn't have time to read more than one, but the article I read is the one that everyone's talking about from the New Yorker from 2013 called The Shadow Commander by Dexter Filkins. It's a profile of Soleimani. And I wanted to share some aspects, some specific readings from this article with you because they complicate the way we're talking about the man and Quds Force and the entire situation. One thing that spurred my curiosity about this, I do want to say, is he's been characterized as a terrorist, and it's been said that he has killed hundreds of Americans. And I wanted to sort of interrogate that claim. Let's assume that is true. What does that mean? How did he do it? In what circumstances and why? And this is not a defense of it. What this is a pushback on the idea that understanding why people do things is a defense of it, right? Grown-ups are supposed to be able to interrogate, why did someone do something the way that they did, right? Without being accused of being soft or a sympathizer or whatever. Grown-ups try to understand things, period. And what is soft is to give in to the idea that you just label everything bad, right? We're going to get to the axis of evil. Let me put it that way. Quoting from Filkins' article in the New Yorker, in 2010, according to Western official, the Quds Force and Hezbollah launched a new campaign against American and Israeli targets in apparent retaliation for the covert effort to slow down the Iranian nuclear program, which has included cyber attacks and assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists. So imagine you're a besieged country. You're trying to develop the weaponry that appears to be the one golden ticket that ensures that you'll not be invaded by America. And assassins are killing your top nuclear scientists. It's impossible for Americans to imagine the degree of freakout we would be having if that were the case here. So the idea that Iran would respond, again, to the assassination of top nuclear scientists, the idea that they would respond to that in a way that we would find extreme is obvious. Of course they would. So would we. Quote, since then, Soleimani has orchestrated attacks in places as far-flung as Thailand, New Delhi, Lagos, and Nairobi, at least 30 attempts in the past 2 years alone. The most notorious was a scheme in 2011 to hire a Mexican drug cartel to blow up the Saudi ambassador to the United States as he sat down to eat at a restaurant a few miles from the White House. The cartel member, approached by Soleimani's agent, turned out to be an informant for the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration. Still, after the plot collapsed, 2 former American officials told a congressional committee that Soleimani should be assassinated. Quote, Soleimani travels a lot, one said. He is all over the place. Go get him. Either try to capture him or kill him. Unquote. In Iran, more than 200 dignitaries signed an outraged letter in his defense. A social media campaign proclaimed, we're all Qasem Soleimani. So can you imagine, again, the idea that public officials in an official forum were contemplating the utility and specific plot of how to kill a top leader of the American government? I want to talk a little bit about his background now, because Filkins has some kind of amazing detail here. Soleimani was born in Rabor, an impoverished mountain village in eastern Iran. When he was a boy, and I want to caveat here, to even talk about a terrorist leader as a boy is seen as transgressive, right? Because it suggests that there was a time when he was innocent before becoming evil, right? Just to talk about anyone's childhood is to humanize them. And we have reached a state in our civil discourse, in our politics, where to suggest that someone is human is to commit a sin, is to transgress against the sanctity of one's own country. That's how far down the infantilized rabbit hole we have gotten. When he was a boy, his father, like many other farmers, took out an agricultural loan from the government of the Shah. He owed 900 toman, about $100 at the time, and couldn't pay it back. So as a boy, his father was impoverished by the economic policies and boot on the neck, economic boot on the neck of poor farmers in Iran by the Shah, who, of course, his family had been installed by the CIA. This man has known nothing in his lifetime but the threat of American interference in his country. That's the entire reality this man ever knew. In a brief memoir, Soleimani wrote of leaving home with a young relative named Ahmad Soleimani, who was in a similar situation. Quote, at night we couldn't fall asleep with the sadness of thinking that government agents were coming to arrest our fathers, he wrote. Together they traveled to Kerman, the nearest city, to try to clear their family's debt. The place was unwelcoming. Quote, we were only 13 and our bodies were so tiny, wherever we went, they wouldn't hire us. And again, this is not to say, oh, he's a great guy, I wish he were still alive. The point is to understand people, right? Because as grown-ups, we are supposed to be beyond the idea that he's bad, so he should be dead, right? We're supposed to be at a place where at least the people making the decisions are thinking about what happens if we do this, what happens if we do that? What are the outcomes? Not do I hate him, not is he bad and can I press a button to make him go away, but what is the utilitarian path here? What does the least damage and what provides the best outcomes for Americans and, maybe other people too? Ryan Crocker was the American ambassador to Iraq from 2007 to 2009. During the Iraq War, Crocker sometimes dealt with Soleimani indirectly through Iraqi leaders who shuttled in and out of Tehran. Once, Crocker asked one of the Iraqis if Soleimani was especially religious. The answer was not really. Now that's, I don't think, an uncontroversial claim. Who knows what it means to be not religious in a fundamentalist Islamic republic? I don't know. Not really, Crocker told me. He, quote, he attends mosque periodically. Religion doesn't drive him. Nationalism drives him and the love of the fight. So I want to make a quick point about nationalism, which is the problem with nationalism is not that the country might be good or bad. The problem is that once you adopt nationalism, you're no longer considering whether your country does right or wrong. The entire point of nationalism is not to ask that. That's what we have in the White House right now. We have a nationalist whose only priority is America, right? America first means America before right, America before justice, America before fairness. So if America is the primary value, which the White House is defending, of course we would be allies with Saudi Arabia. Why not? They're on our side. That's all that matters, is the tribalisticness of it. The problem with being nationalistic is that it endorses nationalism, which means that anyone who doesn't benefit from being an American nationalist, their only path to combating that, to rivaling that, is to be a nationalist where they are. And if you grow up in the Islamic authoritarian government of Iran, what else are you going to be but an Iranian nationalist? So the idea that he's bad or evil or whatever you might have sort of renders invisible why he does what he does in a way that we take for granted for why we do what we do. We all understand why we're friends with Saudi Arabia. They've got oil, they've got regional power, they've got our backs in some respects, maybe not so much in others, but everyone understands that it's a question of pragmatism, right? Realpolitik. That we just, this is a concession, a compromise that we have to make. But we don't allow for those considerations when other countries and other people make them. Let's talk about the Iran-Iraq War. Iran's leaders took two lessons from the Iran-Iraq War. The first was that Iran was surrounded by enemies near and far. To the regime, the Iranian regime, the invasion was not so much an Iraqi plot as a Western one. American officials were aware of Saddam's preparations to invade Iraq in 1980, and they later provided him with targeting information used in chemical weapons attacks. The weapons themselves were built with the help of Western European firms. So let's keep in mind, Soleimani spent 8 years fighting and watching people he cared about, people he led, soldiers he led, die. 8 years watching them die at the hands of an invading army that was explicitly backed by the United States of America, including up to and including assisting with chemical weapons attacks. Again, can you imagine what the United States would refer to that as if it were on the receiving end? The memory of these attacks is an especially bitter one. Quote, do you know how many people are still suffering from the effects of chemical weapons? It's not in the past, right? They're still living with this. They know these people who are walking around still suffering from the effects. This is according to Mehdi Kalaji, a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, talking to Filkins, says, quote, thousands of former soldiers, they believe these were Western weapons given to Saddam, unquote. In 1987, during a battle with the Iraqi army, a division under Soleimani's command was attacked by artillery shells containing chemical weapons. More than 100 of his men suffered the effects. The other lesson drawn from the Iran-Iraq War was the futility of fighting a head-to-head confrontation. In 1982, after the Iranians expelled the Iraqi forces, Ayatollah Khomeini, ordered his men to keep going, to liberate Iraq and push on to Jerusalem. 6 years and hundreds of thousands of lives later, he agreed to a ceasefire. According to Al-Fonay, I'm sorry, I don't have the reference there. I don't have the first reference there. Many of the generals of Soleimani's generation believe they could have succeeded had the clerics not flinched. In other words, they could have won if only Tehran, Washington, had had their backs. Many of them feel like they were stabbed in the back, he said. They have nurtured this myth for nearly 30 years. But Iran's leaders did not want another bloodbath. Instead, they had to build the capacity to wage asymmetrical warfare, attacking stronger powers indirectly outside of Iran. In other words, they suffered this traumatic invasion 1 million people died, we're talking about. More Iranians than Iraqis, which was spurred by and abetted by Western powers, okay? And then Iran is winning. They're on the road to Baghdad. And they realize that's going to be worse than anything. We can do more to protect ourselves, to preserve and perhaps grow our regional influence, because why wouldn't you want to do that after having been invaded, right? They can do that with asymmetrical warfare, which we call terrorism. We have the luxury of calling it terrorism because we have the luxury of waging our own form of asymmetrical warfare. What we do is also asymmetrical warfare because no one has our military strength, right? Trump brags about that all the time. No one's got the military we do. Well, then it's asymmetrical. The Quds Force was an ideal tool. Khomeini had created the prototype for the force in 1979 with the goal of protecting Iran and exporting the Islamic Revolution. The first big opportunity came in Lebanon, where Revolutionary Guard officers were dispatched in 1982 to help organize Shiite militias in the many-sided Lebanese civil war. Those efforts resulted in the creation of Hezbollah, which developed under Iranian guidance. So the point of that little history lesson is these terrorist blights that we have now, Hezbollah, the Quds Force, all of these things were reactions, at least in part, to the US-backed, abetted invasion of Iran, right? It's unintended consequences. Because all we're thinking about is, who's the good guy? Who's the bad guy? In 1989 and afterwards, Soleimani worked along Iran's eastern frontier. Oh, here's where I want to get to the point of he's a bad guy, he's a terrorist. It's simplistic, it's simplistic. We heard the same thing about Saddam Hussein, again, who just 15 years before had been our ally, right? Suddenly these guys take evil pills and now they've got to be wiped off the map. Soleimani worked along Iran's eastern frontier, aiding Afghan rebels who were holding out against the Taliban. He was fighting the Taliban, okay? Let that sink in. The Iranian regime regarded the Taliban with intense hostility, in large part because of their persecution of Afghanistan's minority Shiite population. At one point, the two countries nearly went to war. Iran mobilized 250,000 troops, and its leaders denounced the Taliban as an affront to Islam. So, with all these factions that were, of course, created or at least exacerbated by, decades of colonialism there, with all these factions, everyone's going to be the enemy of someone else's enemy and or friend, right? So it's not a case, it's what grownups do, they don't look at this fractured, shattered map and say who's good and who's bad. They look and try to figure out what are the best outcomes we can gain from working in what ways with which factions. It's complicated and it's hard. And the Filkins piece has a lot of background, some of which I'll get to, about how we were working with them. And in ways that looked poised to bring good results at points. In an area that breeds corruption, Soleimani made a name for himself battling opium smugglers along the Afghan border. What else do we have here? Okay, here's a big chunk. This is when the US had not yet gone into Afghanistan. But the US was talking with Iran about it. Before the bombing began, before the bombing of Afghanistan, Crocker, that was the US ambassador later, he was in the State Department, I believe, at the time. Before the bombing began, Crocker sensed that the Iranians were growing impatient with the Bush administration, thinking that it was taking too long to attack the Taliban. So it's hard to imagine, but Iran was one of the loudest voices, albeit in secret, cheerleading for the US to invade Afghanistan, or at least to bomb Afghanistan, right? Puts them in lockstep with all the warmongering, saber-rattling conservatives. At a meeting in early October 2001, 1 month after 9/11, the lead Iranian negotiator stood up and slammed a sheaf of papers on the table. Quote, "If you guys, the Americans, don't stop building these fairy tale governments in the sky and actually start doing some shooting on the ground, None of this is ever going to happen, he shouted. When you're ready to talk about serious fighting, you know where to find me. He stomped out of the room. Quote, "It was a great moment," Crocker said. The cooperation between the two countries lasted through the initial phase of the war. At one point, the lead negotiator, this is an Iranian diplomat, handed Crocker a map detailing the disposition of Taliban forces. This is Iranian intel that they're now showing to Crocker. Quote, "Here's our advice. Hit them here first and then hit them over here. And here's the logic." And stunned, Crocker asked, quote, "Can I take notes?" Right? Crocker wants to be able to share this information. The negotiator, the Iranian diplomat, says to the United States diplomat, "You can keep the map." The flow of information went both ways. On one occasion, Crocker said he gave his counterparts the location of an al-Qaeda facilitator. The Iranians detained the facilitator and brought him to Afghanistan's new leaders, who, Crocker believes, turned him over to the US. The negotiator told Crocker, quote, "Qasem is very pleased with our cooperation." And then, of course, we screw it up. The goodwill didn't last. In January 2002, Crocker, who was by then the deputy chief of the American embassy in Kabul, was awakened one night by aides who told him that President George W. Bush, in his State of the Union address, had named Iran as part of an axis of evil. So the people who were helping us go into Afghanistan, the people who were helping us get bin Laden, Qasem Soleimani, all of these people on our side against the Taliban, providing us with intel, helping us capture people, they're part of the axis of evil. Like many senior diplomats, Crocker was caught off guard. He saw the negotiator the next day at the UN compound in Kabul, and he was furious. Quote, "You completely damaged me," Crocker recalled him saying. "Soleimani is in a tearing rage. He feels compromised." The negotiator told Crocker that at great political risk, Soleimani had been contemplating a complete reevaluation of the United States, saying, quote, "Maybe it's time to rethink our relationship with the Americans." We had that moment in our hand. The axis of evil speech brought the meetings to an end. Reformers inside the government who had advocated a rapprochement with the United States were put on the defensive. Recalling that time, Crocker shook his head, quote, "We were just that close," he said. One word in one speech changed history. So I could go on. It's a great article. And I made a few points that I wanted to make. I made a few notes that I wanted to say, which was, I've covered some of them, but I do want to add that Pompeo today says the U.S. is committed to de-escalation. And here's what I would say about that before I see what you guys have to say in the comments. The tribalistic, nationalistic response to Pompeo is to be like Trump and to say, "Liar, you don't want de-escalation, you want war." If we want to reject the embrace of, I'm sorry, but infantile, black and white, good, evil politics and military policy and foreign policy, then when the guy that you think of evil, Mike Pompeo, comes out and says he's committed to de-escalation, you don't react the way Trump would to Soleimani. You react the way Crocker would to Soleimani, and you say, good. You take the opportunity. You want to de-escalate? We support de-escalation. I might still think you're a POS, but I support de-escalation, and I will work with you and support the pursuit of this goal, right? To reject everything that comes out of them as evil is to commit exactly the sin that they're committing, which got us here on the brink of who knows what right now. So that's my non-expert opinion on the Middle East and where we are at the moment. Now, let's get some probably more informed opinions from you folks, and let's see what you have to say. Reptile Z says, good morning, friends. Alice Murphy says, good morning, Jonathan and everyone. Nathaniel Earl says, hey, John, Nate from Chicago. John Q says, buckle up, folks. Let's hope for the best. Let's work for the best, too, right? when they talk about de-escalation, we say, yeah, right on, right on. Let's de-escalate right now. What does that look like? How do we do that? Gone Diamond says, nice scarf, John, and thank you for talking about the biggest news of the day. I always appreciate your takes. Thank you very much. I got this for Christmas and I cannot take it off. It is that comfortable. And also I'm cold, but thank you. And thank you for the kind words about my takes. I appreciate it. Dancing Lunalight says, if children were running foreign policy, it would have to be better than the adults in the room. I agree to some extent, right? The conflict mediation is a real thing with kids, right? They're taught, at least in some schools, they're taught how to mediate with each other and how to de-escalate. Tommy B says, Trump did this in part just because Obama did good on Iran and Trump was jealous and now he listened to Bolton and Pompeo. They all are war criminals and need to be locked up. I'm sorry, Tommy, but I kind of reject that thinking. I don't think it's useful or helpful for us to interrogate psychological motives so much as it is to interrogate the same thing with Soleimani and Iran. What do they stand to gain by it? Why, what are their fears, right? The thing with the axis of evil, here's the moment where I talk about this a lot. I was working at CNN on 9/11 in New York, and I was actually very heartened by like the first 24 to 48 hours of rhetoric from Mayor Giuliani and from President Bush, because they were talking about it as a crime, not as an act of war, not as an existential threat. By the end of the week, that had all changed. And at some point, Bush says something about literally eradicating evil from the world. And I just had this horrible feeling in the pit of my stomach, because that's a child speaking. That is how children think about eradicating evil. If you have no tolerance for anything threatening in the world, that's ingredient number one for the recipe for endless war, right? In the past, when America has been comprised mostly of grown-ups, we have understood that bad things will happen. Terrorism will happen. Assassinations may happen. They don't, however bad you think they are, does not justify a maximalist response, unless your goal is to eliminate all evil in the world, which is what you say when you are a coward, when it scares you to live in a world where there are people who want to harm you and people who want to do bad things. I get a lot of heat for, I guess, and the scarf is not going to help, for being like not an alpha male in these commentaries. I don't sit here and thunder on about whatever it is people want me to thunder on about. But, I grew up in New York City in the 1970s, right? And you came to understand pretty quickly that bad things could happen, and you didn't freak out about it. It was a bad thing. It happened. You got mugged. They took your money. They stole your bike. Okay, that sucks. And then you move on, right? It doesn't make you especially brave necessarily, but it's better than the alternative of just being paralyzed, excuse me, and dedicating every possible effort towards eradicating even the possibility of something bad happening. That's a child. That's a scared child. And our vision of strength and weakness got entirely warped in the generation since then. Now it's seen as weakness to know, like a grown-up knows, that there are bad things in the world. Now a tough guy's goal, the very point of being tough, is to make sure nothing can ever hurt me again. That's not a tough guy. I don't care if you say it real tough, we're going to get everyone. That's because you're scared, like a child. Grow up. Now I'm talking like a tough guy. I apologize. We now return to your soy boy programming. Let's see. Freeman says, how many U.S. hostages does Iran have right now? I don't know. Freeman says, it was a totally legit assassination. During the staged embassy protest, an American's shoes fell off and he bumped his funny bone and it got all tingly like. I don't even know what to say about that. And again, the amount of certainty that people have about this stuff is mind-boggling to me. Like, If you're too young to remember the Iraq War and how everyone got played and everyone helped play everyone else, read up a little bit, okay? But this idea that you know why they stormed the embassy, based on what? Intel? Which has been vetted how? Which we're supposed to believe why? Grow up. Embassies have been attacked forever. Forever. And assassin, by the way, used to be a bad word. It was synonymous with coward, right? That was something that you did when you were a coward. You sent an assassin or you were an assassin because you couldn't have the face-to-face fight. Now that in and of itself is a juvenile way of thinking about conflict, but you're flying a banner that used to be considered one of shame. To be an assassin, to use assassins was to be craven, was to be weak and vile. So way to go, embracing that standard. Rita Campbell says Trump is reckless, predatory, and irresponsible. He's evil. Again, I don't think the response to them seeing the world that way is for us to see the world that way. It will have just as bad results for us. Pardon me. Dan Sissing, Lunalight says, how many countries has Iran invaded? 0. Well, you can make the case that they invaded Iraq in return for having been invaded first, but let's not pretend that it's some moral high point that Iran instead decided to engage in what we classify traditionally as terrorism, right? Just because you decided you don't have the martial force to invade, so instead you're going to fund and facilitate bombings and assassinations. That's not really moral high ground. But we don't have to give them the high ground in order to acknowledge that we're not standing on high ground either, right? Just the competition for high ground is an offshoot of nationalism, right? If you proclaim your country to be the best, USA #1, all that stuff, then wherever you are, by definition, is the moral high ground. And you now start to rationalize things that make it the high ground. And that's where we get the moral problems that arise, which is why nationalism's got to go. Not just theirs, ours too, if only because it facilitates theirs. Goldfish likes the scarf plus mic look. Thank you very much for that. Mr. Elder says, if war breaks out, millions of lives could be lost. So here's one thing I want to talk about, which is everyone's talking about World War III and how war is going to break out. I don't think anyone thinks for a second, well, that's not true. Lots of people think, but I don't think for a second that Trump is going to send 250,000 Americans into Iran on the ground. What Trump is likely to do is want to have it both ways, which is not send a single person to go get shot and just lob tomahawks from the Gulf, right? Just station a few battle groups, within striking range of Iran and just bomb the crap out of them whenever you want. That's what the war would look like if it comes to that, which, by the way, could also mean millions of people die. It just wouldn't be Americans. And the way America responds to a war that's just as devastating in terms of fatalities as the Iraq War, but none of them are Americans, that would be an awful, heartbreaking test of the moral character of this country at this moment in time. John Q says, I wish I could press a button to make people go away. Well, that's what the president just did. Heather Vesper says, hey, been a while. Glad I made it this morning. Thank you for making it, Heather. Sorry I was a few minutes late. Mike Hawkins says, so this guy is an expert, huh? Mike, if you rewind back to the top of this video, literally the first thing I said is, I'm not an expert. So if you want to take what I'm saying, not take it at face value, I encourage everyone to be skeptical about everything. You should be. But if the logic parses, at least take it into consideration, right? I don't think I've made a lot of factual claims that we should be certain about X, Y, or Z. I'm making claims about the logic with which we approach these issues. And you don't have to be an expert to apply logic to something. Ian James Chapman says the U.S. helped overthrow democratically elected governments in both Iran and Guatemala in the 1950s. USA. Mike Hawkins says, dude, you're a gay American self-hater. I bet you white shame yourself too. Okay. It's so weird as a grown man in my 50s to still get that, like, you know, playground level insults, like from grown-ups now. You're supposed to move beyond ad hominem, and you're certainly supposed to move beyond ad hominem that's targeting what your guess is about my sexuality. Why are you thinking about my sexuality, dude? Is it the scarf? Is it working for you? Like, what's going on there, buddy? And by the way, for folks who do like the scarf, great, that's cool. Of whatever gender, I don't care. I'm happy that it's working for anyone. My sister-in-law is going to be thrilled. I was already going to tell her that I'm wearing it inside the house nonstop. But now that I'm getting all this kind of attention online, inspiring these like primal playground thoughts from Mike Hawkins, well, she's going to get a kick out of that, I'm sure. Gone Diamond says, do you think that Trump ordered the strike to boost his poll numbers? Hadn't Nixon considered something similar to distract from impeachment? Thanks again for your work. So I want to address the question, but I also want to say we shouldn't be thinking about questions like that, precisely because it's speculative. We don't know. And it's really only about interrogating, what do we think he is, right? What is his essence? What is his core? That said, I will answer it to say in the negative, I don't think he did. For one thing, I don't know that he would necessarily think that it would boost his poll numbers. I think it's very Occam's razor to approach this as, you know, the American embassy got stormed, was violated, if you want to put it in those terms. I'm sure he was advised that Iran was behind it. And depending on how many causal leaps you want to make and how simplistic you want to be about the thinking, I'm sure there's reason to believe some degree of that. And so he wanted to hit back. He didn't like what happened to him, and so he wanted to hit back. I don't think that he necessarily thinks that it would necessarily help his poll numbers. He's had these things in the past, and he tends to think that everything he does is great and wonderful, so why wouldn't everything boost his poll numbers, including not going to war? I don't think he feels especially compelled to do things to make other people happy. I don't get a strong sense from him about that. Maybe in terms of in the moment, I think there's a case to be made that when he's talking with people, he wants them to like him and will say things that he thinks will endear him to them. But this strikes me as something different. But again, my bigger point would be like, we gotta, I think, move away from those kinds of questions in these dialogues, right? Let's focus on, let's learn what we can about what moves Iran in what ways and why, right? Let's assume that they are rational actors acting in self-interest, and then start from there, right? We, as Crocker said in Dexter Filkin's piece, we were that close. If we were that close before, we can potentially be that close again. You know, taking out Soleimani is clearly a very, very significant thing in Iran's perspective. But is it really bigger than enabling chemical warfare attacks on Iran by an invading army? And we were able to come back from that. We can come back from any of this stuff. But if we immediately reject Mike Pompeo when he says they're interested in de-escalation, that makes it harder. That boxes Pompeo in and disincentivizes him from embracing de-escalation. Maybe Pompeo wants de-escalation, but is trying to fight against others in the administration who don't want de-escalation. Shouldn't we help Mike Pompeo in that case? no matter how much we hate Mike Pompeo? If we could talk with Iran about fighting the Taliban, surely we can talk with Mike Pompeo about fighting the John Boltons, right? If we're going to recognize realpolitik and the fact that it makes other agents act in ways that we don't like, we ought to be willing to as well, when we have good, clear moral outcomes. We don't have to endorse Mike Pompeo for president, just endorse de-escalation, right? And amplify his call for de-escalation. Mark Jackson says it's all about big oil and a distraction from impeachment. Again, I would reject it's all about. That's essentialist thinking. These are complicated things. And of course, oil is a part of it, but we have to move away from simplistic thinking about this stuff. They're bad, they want the oil, they hate Muslims. These are all simplistic thinking. And mostly what they do is they feed our confirmation bias about them being bad people. And that's something we also have to move away from, because that's exactly the mindset that they're using to look at Iran. Hannah Pause says, when Trump hired John Bolton, he wanted war with Iran. Now he has given himself an excuse to have it. Sorry, I got to take a moment to report some hate speech there. Not against me, I should say. Hate speech against me is fine, as long as you don't end up going after groups in the process. Direct hits are okay. I will not tolerate collateral damage. Mark Jackson says W used Iraq war to assure re-election. Goldfish says peep Trump's anti-Obama tweets from 2011. He said that Obama would pursue war with Libya or Iran to move towards re-election. I actually posted earlier this morning, I posted a collection of videos of Trump from 2011, including that clip. So if you look on our channel, plug for subscribing, by the way, to TYTI Investigates. If you look, the video we posted this morning is a couple of clips about Trump contemplating war with Iran back in 2011. Mark Jackson said, oh, Hannah Pause says, how likely is it that we will invade Iran? I think I talked about this a few minutes ago. I don't think we're going to invade Iran. The question is, how many Tomahawk missiles and other missiles are we willing to just lob from offshore to take out whatever targets we think are justified by whatever Iran does, to retaliate for what we just did, to retaliate against what we thought they just did, to retaliate against what we had done prior to that, 1953, Shah of Iran. Mark Jackson says, I thought Trump said Hillary would cause a war with Iran. Sorry, hold on. I always take it as a good sign when we get the haters showing up, just because it means people are paying attention. So thank you for paying attention, despite my non-expertness. I hope that we can have conversations about things without being experts, if we are careful about what we're willing to assert as fact and the limits of our insights on the issues. Erwin Rommel says, guessing that's not your real name, says the Taliban were a threat to the oil. And I don't know whether that's true, but it certainly might be true. There are typically lots of different reasons, right, for the various factions and factionalism. Okay. Sorry, I just mass deleted someone, so they're gone. William Martyr says Trump and his advisors and whoever authorized this in the military itself has opened up Pandora's box. That may certainly be true, and it remains to be seen what Iran will do, but it's not inevitable. It's not inevitable. And to whatever extent we have a role to play in the voices that we lift up and amplify, I hope that we can react in a way that's less about moral outrage towards the people who have done this and more about positive outcomes which reflect the prioritization of the people who will suffer if we indulge the desire for moral outrage, right? That's what essentially this assassination was. It was a physical expression of moral outrage. And it's hard because moral outrage is an extension of our instinct for justice. And that is, I think, a healthy, or at least a natural response. But justice is not always the pursuit of justice to avenge those who have been wronged, to punish those who've done the wrong. That doesn't always create the best future for the people who come afterwards. And don't get me wrong, I'm not in the camp of like President Obama saying we're not going to prosecute torturers. There was not a lot of real downside there. And in that case, pursuing justice was about preventing it from happening again. So maybe it's a tenuous line I'm walking there, but I'm trying to walk it. Let's see what else you guys have to say. William Marta says, in the argument of making the troops in U.S. safer, he has done the opposite. I think I'm going to go with 1,000,000%. I'm not sure exactly what that last line means. Bridge Forest says, TYT member, but new to TYTI, and dude, you're setting a high bar for my expectations. This stream is very insightful and appreciated. Thanks. Well, Bridge 4, thanks so much for saying that. That's really kind of you to say. And obviously I've screwed up because I would never ever want to set a high bar for expectations because that's difficult to meet on a regular basis. To whatever extent today's thoughts have been worthwhile, I think, it's in large part because Dexter Filkins back in 2013 did that amazing piece for the New Yorker. And in it are lots of insights which we might have gotten at the time because they weren't, the moment wasn't as charged as 9/11 was or as today is, right? You could do that and speak more freely in a way that's more free of like the fear of judgment about being soft on terror or whatever it might be. So Ryan Crocker could have these conversations about Americans at negotiating tables with terrorists, which, by the way, I should point out, the Trump administration has spent most of his tenure as president sitting down having discussions with the Taliban, which is a good thing, right? That's a better thing than having people die. Talking with people across a table is better than having other people die. Full stop. Anyway, Bridge 4, if you stick around, you will learn or be advised by the regulars here that I am terrible at taking compliments. So if you want to throw me off my game or have me go off into a weird babble spiral, the best way to ensure that that happens is to compliment me. So thank you very much. Welcome. I hope you'll subscribe and let people know. That's the best way you can support us, is by sharing what we've got to say with other folks. Okay. Gustavo Fabregas says, Netanyahu pushed Trump to do this. If you have a link proving that, please share it. If you don't know that, don't say that. If you don't know that something is true, do not say that. Please. And if you do know that something is true, share how you know, right? I just sat here and I made very clear that I was reading from a 2013 article in a magazine that people know and are familiar with and have some idea of the standards and the integrity. And I quoted the author by name and I read specific passages. We're not all journalists, but we all have to live up to that standard now, right? There's no line anymore between journalists and non-journalists anymore. It used to be that you needed to be able to print, to buy ink by the barrel and have a printer and rolls of paper to print on. That made you a journalist. Why? Because you could get what you were saying to people. Well, now there's no such bar. Anyone can get a Twitter account. But as soon as you are talking to people, outside of just yammering to your spouse, you now have the obligations that come with speaking to people. If you're going to tell people that something is true and you don't know those people and you don't know whether that's going to spread, You have to live up to that obligation. We all have that obligation now. We have to live up to it. Let's see. Reptile Z said, getting close to 200 peeps live chat today. I think we actually went over 200. And it's funny because I have conflicted feelings about it. There's a part of me that wrestles every day with, do I try to come up with something new to say about what everyone's talking about? Or do I try to like honor and amplify stories that aren't being talked about enough, right? Which almost never does as well as jumping on the trend bandwagon. And therefore disincentivizes me to do it, right? Because as a journalist and as a human, I want to do good in the world. And jumping on a bandwagon seldom does good, and potentially risks doing harm. So my own calculation tends to be, if I think that the bandwagon is going in a bad direction, to try to offer a corrective. And I hope that doesn't mean that I'm a sellout for doing it, or what have you. And I hope that we earned the extra eyeballs today for what that's worth. William Martyr is talking about the Jesuits, which that's what William does, just so people know. And we're getting a fair amount of really vile rhetoric from people. And I think it's important to understand that people can say the most evil things without themselves being evil. They can be screwed up. They can be depressed. They can be lonely. Sometimes if you are not being heard and you feel like the only way you will be heard is to say something ugly, that is why you will say it. Doesn't mean I'm going to permit those statements to live on my YouTube channel, but I guess if you're watching and you're tempted to say something ugly about other people, you're trying to get a reaction out of people, which in its own way is trying to make a connection. And what I would ask you to do, or at least just to try, is instead of trying to connect by poking people, by trying to arouse the ire or disgust or moral revulsion of others, try connecting by committing random acts of altruism. If not in real life, then online. Go find someone's Twitter feed and amplify them and say something positive, right? Just try it, even if it's purely as an exercise, even if you don't believe it, even if you think it's a goof. Try being kind to someone. Try connecting with them in a way that lifts them up, in a specific direct connection, rather than just making a broad attack on a group of people, because that's the only way you can think of. Now you can think of something else. At least try it. See what happens. Maybe it feels weird at first, but keep at it. Maybe at some point it feels good and you get a connection with people that's actually elevating for you and for them. And maybe that feels good, and maybe you can do that. Just because you say something vile once, as all too often is the case as a young man, that doesn't mean you can't come back from that place. So the sooner you try to get onto a road of connecting with people and being positive with people, the more likely you are, I think, to put the vile stuff, which I guarantee you're going to feel bad about sometime later. The sooner you can put that in the rearview mirror. Let's see. Sorry, we're getting a ton of sad people here who can only think of who can only get attention by hurting others or trying to hurt others. Let's see. I lost the thread a bit. Francis Wolf, I think I caught you in mid-comment there. All right, I'm going to see if I can go back up and catch where you are. All right, I give up. No, wait, I just saw a compliment. Now I'm like, a compliment. Someone said, good stream, John, and then I immediately lost it. Peanut 3050 says, blah, blah, blah. Fair enough. Sorry, I can't read that. Lil the Great says, the best revenge for Iran may just be democracy. Wait a month before the elections and close down the Hormuz. Send oil prices in a tailspin and devastate Trump days before the election. I haven't checked this morning, but apparently crude prices went nuts last night. So who knows how that's going to go. All right. I'm sorry I missed all the conversation in the beginning. I mean, in the middle there. I got lost banning trolls. Okay, so let's see where I can pick up with you guys. Really Cool says both Obama and even Bush knew better than to get into war with Iran. That's true, but it doesn't mean that we weren't messing with them in our own way back then. And we're not. This assassination, any drone strike, a single drone strike, right, on foreign soil, that's an act of war, right? So in theory, we were already at war with Iran, but just the word war has taken on this fuzzy aspect where things that once would have constituted an act of war, and then everyone would have understood, okay, armies marching against each other, rah, rah, shoot, shoot. That's kind of out the window. That's the exception rather than the norm at this point. And I think that's dangerous because that makes it a lot easier, rhetorically speaking, to wage essentially a one-sided, painless, for the American side, war, where you just kill people remotely in Iran over and over and over again, pound, 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 until you essentially, reduce whatever's left of the economy to a rubble and devastate the population because they're dependent on a government, which obviously is a terrible authoritarian theocratic government, but there's going to be no American pushback because no Americans are dying. There's no quagmire. There's no cost to the US, right? Technology has managed to disrupt war just like it's managed to disrupt employment and the economy and all these other things. So that, to me, is the biggest danger here. The reasons not to get into a war with Iran used to be because Americans will die. If it's no longer the case that Americans will die, what's the argument for not getting into a war with Iran? Because they're bad. Reptile Z says, keep doing what you're doing, JL. It's working. Thank you so much, Reptile. I'm never sure of that myself, but I'm moved genuinely by hearing that you folks think so. That to me defines what is working. Francis, I missed your thread. I'm going to go back and take a look afterwards, I promise. Red Pill says freedom of speech. People should be smart enough to do their own research rather than jump on a bandwagon. So I agree, but I don't know how realistic that is. Should all people be smart enough to do that? Is that ideally, yes, we should be educating our entire population to be smart enough to recognize what claims of fact and what claims of principle ought to be material claims regarding the decisions about the future of our country. But we don't do that, and it's not realistic to expect everyone to pay sufficient attention to do that. That's what the founders envisioned, right? The idea that the founders were talking about was that people, and of course by people they meant landed white males, landed meaning they owned property, that they would all be sufficiently educated and informed for it to be a participatory system. Again, participated in only by a certain class of people, but it was broader than the sort of monarchic governments that they had left behind. Bridge Force says, thanks, Francis. How come they don't ever feature this wizard on the daily news? This channel must be a gem. Let's spread the word. I hope you're talking about me. That's very kind of you, Bridge 4. Thank you very much. And if you're talking about someone else, well, let's spread the word about them too. Anyone, me or otherwise, who gets that kind of praise, yes, let's try to amplify. Let's try to amplify, even if you don't agree with me, just the fact that you don't agree with the sort of martial drumbeat, the black and white thinking. I can never remember how to pronounce Manichaean, but this simplistic, polarized view of he was the #1 bad guy, I think CNBC said. Just grow up. You don't have to agree with me, but let's amplify any voice out there that pushes back against this simplistic, childish, cowardly, unable to tolerate the slightest scintilla of opposition anywhere on the planet. That's cowardly. That is a terrified child. It's worse because even children aren't terrified that way. It takes a special kind of grown-up to learn nothing about the world except that somewhere there's someone to be afraid of, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to find that person or that group, and they're going to haunt my brain, and they're going to motivate everything I do because I found someone to justify this need for something to be afraid of. It's not just fear, it's fearophilia, right? It's this addiction to fear and to being afraid. And when they kill bin Laden, they'll find someone else to be afraid of. And when they kill Soleimani, who, by the way, instantly became the world's #1 bad guy, go look at how often anyone was out there, Marco Rubio, Lindsey Graham, how much talking were they doing over the past year, 2 years about the existential, specific, unique threat that guy posed? As if he didn't have anyone who worked for him. Everyone's like, oh, time to shut down Quds Force. He was the guy, that's it. Well, time to pack it up. Everyone ready for representational democracy? Because that's where we're going to have to go now. Qassem is gone. Oh, well, we gave it a shot. Time to be good guys again. Just take a second. Harumph. James Fox says, Hillary, Trump, the corporation's outlook would have turned out the same. It's only when you remove the corporate office and you get results. Maybe, maybe not. That's the awful thing about this stuff is we don't ever get to know how the counterfactual would turn out. And we don't get to claim that we do either. We don't know. Ali J says, Francis Wolf says, we may not... Addressing Francis, Ali says, we may not be able to stop it, but there are anti-war movements you can get involved with. I experienced your panic when Bush invaded Iraq. Protesting, marching at least gave me a focus. I found this to be very true on 9/11. Find something you can do to contribute, to amplify voices, to join with others that have a specific, identifiable, quantifiable outcome, right? Find a candidate you want to work for, channel the angst and the nerves that you have about this. The remedy, the cure for that is to do something. Francis says, thanks, crew. I was freaking out. I love the fact that I totally missed out on what Francis was saying here. But you knit together and you created a safety net, parachute, whatever metaphor you want to talk about. You made it and you brought Francis back. I love it. I love that. Red Pill says, punks for progress. I have been red pilled. I question everything. It's tricky when we say we question everything. Sometimes what that means is we assume that when we're told X, we believe that X is not true. that's not questioning everything. That's just a negative correlation for gullibility, right? Rejecting something is not true is not questioning it. And I'm not saying you're doing that, but we have seen that in our chat where people say, no, this must be false. I'm a skeptic. Well, saying it must be false means you're not a skeptic. It means you're gullible, just mirror image. Mark Jackson says, cute cat. You're welcome to have her. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. She is cute. I just forgot to put her behind a door today, so I've been fending her off during this. Oh my gosh, I've been going more than an hour too. So I am going to wrap it up, even though a lot of you folks are still watching, which is just amazing to me. Thanks so much, folks. Charles Main says, you're reporting as good as or better than Cenk. Well, that's high praise indeed, especially considering that I don't have his performative zest, right? I love doing the Cenk. If you don't watch Cenk, he has this thing where he'll say something and then he'll answer it with, of course. And I just I love it. Like if I could wrap that up and wear it like a scarf, I would. But I don't have that performative talent that he does. Francis Wolf says, see, Jonathan, whilst you were fighting off trolls, all my TYTI buds helped me chill. I love that. Okay. Dem by default says, kindness costs us nothing. Cruelty has a very high cost. I tend to agree with that, but I also think that there's an intuitive counter argument to that, which is, and I'm not endorsing this, I'm saying this is how some people see the world. When you're kind, you're giving permission to that person to do their evil again in the future. Cruelty provides a disincentive. And so that's the thinking, is that you can control things, right? And that when you have the means to control things, the #1 military force in Earth's history, when you have the means to do that, every wrong that you let go feels like an endorsement. And so you feel compelled to apply the tool that you have to achieve the outcome you want. The problem is, of course, that we're not talking about physics, we're talking about psychology, and using that tool has its own consequences. People will respond to your use of the tool. Read the article by Dexter Filkins. Everyone is their own victim, is the victim in their own version of this story. Iran is just retaliating for things that the US did to Iran. The US is just retaliating for things that Iran did to US. This is well, he started it level thinking. And the only way out is to reject that and to say, I refuse to see conflict in those terms anymore. It's not about justice for whatever happened last. It has to be about justice for the people of the future that we don't want living under these clouds anymore. Okay, with that, I'm going to stop talking. I don't mean to shock anyone, since I've been talking for an hour, so I would understand. About half an hour ago, someone said blah, 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 which I get it. I'm not arguing. I didn't do my media analysis Fridays, which is my usual shtick on Fridays. So I apologize for anyone who showed up for media analysis Fridays. Obviously, if you want to, there's some subtext for the media here if anyone wants to see it. But I will end with what I end with every time, which is take care of each other, take care of yourselves, and we are here, if you're watching us for the first time today, we are here every weekday at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Please subscribe to TYT Investigates so that you can catch TYTI Daily every day, as well as the occasional other videos we do. If you're new to us, you should also know we don't just do commentary about what's in the news, we also break news. We discuss our own stories. In fact, as I mentioned on Twitter earlier this morning, I was going to publish a story this morning, which I did not, because who's going to read it today? So hopefully that story will be up Monday. I've got another story coming up with a collaborator I'm really excited about and really enjoyed working with. And I think you folks will be excited about the collaborator I'm talking about, as well as what we came up with. So hopefully both of those, and possibly even one more, will come next week. So subscribe to TYT Investigates, and you will have us talking about all of that stuff and more next week and on into the glorious future. Take care of each other. Take care of yourselves. Have a great weekend. Bye.